There are ships, and then there are legends. Most vessels that have ever sailed the world's oceans have been quietly swallowed by time. Their timbers rotted, their names forgotten, their stories dissolved into the salt and silence of the deep. But then, standing apart from all of them, there is one ship that history itself refused to forget. She has been afloat, in one form or another, for more than 2.5 centuries. Her keel was laid in the year 1759, a time when the American colonies still answered to a British crown, when Mozart was a child of 3, and when the very idea of a steam-powered vessel was nothing more than an impossible fantasy. She was launched in 1765, commissioned into service in 1778, and she has not stopped astonishing the world since. Her name is HMS Victory, and she is the oldest naval warship in existence still on active service anywhere on Earth. But to call her simply a warship is to call St. Paul's Cathedral simply a building. It is technically true, but it misses everything that matters. A giant among giants. Victory was a first-rate ship of the line, the absolute pinnacle of 18th century naval engineering, the dreadnought of her age. In a fleet of warships, the rating system was everything. A 6th-rate vessel carried perhaps 20 guns and was considered a modest fighting craft. A 3rd-rate, the backbone of most battle fleets, might carry 74 guns across 2 decks and require a crew of 500 or 600 men. These were formidable, feared, and powerful ships. But a first-rate was in an entirely different world. HMS Victory carried 104 guns arranged across 3 full gun decks, her broadside alone capable of delivering more than 1,000 pounds of iron at a single discharge, a rolling wall of destruction that could reduce a lesser ship to splinters within minutes. She stretched 227 feet from bowsprit to stern, displaced nearly 3,500 tons of water, and required a full complement of 850 men simply to function in battle. Her mainmast soared 205 feet above the waterline, taller than many church steeples of the era. To stand at her bow and look aft was to understand, immediately and viscerally, why smaller ships simply turned and fled when she appeared on the horizon. She was not merely large, she was overwhelming. She was designed to dominate not just through firepower, but through the sheer psychological weight of her presence. Built for eternity, the construction of HMS Victory consumed some 6,000 oak trees, an entire forest, felled and shaped over the course of many years. Her hull timbers were up to 2.5 feet thick in places, layered and interlocked in ways that made her hull absorb punishment that would have sunk a lesser vessel outright. Her copper-sheathed bottom resisted the barnacles and wood-boring worms that plagued other ships of the era, keeping her swift and seaworthy in ways her enemies could not match. What truly separated Victory from the ordinary warships of her class, however, was something harder to quantify than timber counts or gun tallies. It was the philosophy of her design. She was built not merely to fight one battle, but to fight indefinitely, to be repaired, rebuilt, refitted, and returned to sea again and again. And that is precisely what happened. Over the course of her service life, she was rebuilt and refitted so many times that historians have noted, not entirely in jest, that almost none of her original timber remains. She is, in a sense, a ship of Theseus, perpetually renewed, perpetually herself. The battle that made her immortal Victory had fought in several engagements before the morning of October 21st, 1805. But it was on that single day, off the southwestern coast of Spain, near a cape called Trafalgar, that she stepped beyond history and into legend. The combined fleets of Napoleonic France and Spain had been threatening British naval supremacy for years. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe's land armies, dreamed of crossing the English Channel, of breaking Britain's defiance, of bringing the last major power opposing him to heel. All that stood between that dream and reality was the Royal Navy. And on that autumn morning, everything would be decided. Vice Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson flew his flag from Victory's mainmast as he led the British fleet into what would become the most decisive naval engagement of the age. His strategy was audacious to the point of recklessness. Instead of sailing parallel to the enemy line, exchanging broadsides in the traditional manner, he drove his fleet directly at the Franco-Spanish line in two perpendicular columns, cutting through it, creating chaos, turning the battle into a furious close-range melee where British gunnery discipline and seamanship would prove overwhelming. The British fleet destroyed or captured 22 enemy ships that day, without losing a single vessel of their own. France and Spain would never seriously threaten British naval supremacy again. The threat of invasion, a shadow that had hung over England for years, was lifted in a single afternoon. Nelson himself did not survive to see it. Shot by a French marksman high in the rigging of the enemy ship Redoubtable, he died below decks aboard Victory as the battle still raged around him. His final hours attended by his officers and his devoted crew. He was mourned as no admiral before or since. His body was carried home to England, preserved in a cask of brandy aboard the very ship on which he had won his greatest victory. And HMS Victory herself bore the scars of that battle in her timbers for years afterward. The fear she inspired long before Trafalgar, and for decades after, the reputation of HMS Victory moved ahead of her like a bow wave. Among the pirate crews and privateers that prowled the Atlantic and Mediterranean trade routes, she was spoken of in hushed and careful tones. A first-rate ship of the line in full pursuit was not a threat one could outrun, outmaneuver, or outfight. She was simply and absolutely a force of nature. Pirate captains who might boldly prey upon merchant convoys escorted by lesser vessels took one look at her silhouette on the horizon. Those 3 gun decks, that towering mass of sail, and quietly changed the heading. Within the Royal Navy itself, the effect was different, but equally powerful. To serve aboard Victory was to serve aboard the finest ship in the finest navy in the world, and every man who did knew it. The pride was tangible, the morale was extraordinary. Sailors who had endured the brutal conditions of lesser ships, the leaking hulls, the rotting provisions, the indifferent officers, found aboard Victory a strange and fierce esprit de corps. They were the crew of the flagship. They were the crew of Nelson's ship. They were, in the deepest sense that word can mean at sea, invincible. She still stands watch, today, HMS Victory rests in dry dock at Portsmouth, England, the same city from which she sailed to Trafalgar more than 2 centuries ago. She is the flagship of the First Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, still officially commissioned, still on active service. Her decks are open to visitors. Her gun decks are still laid as they were in battle. A brass plaque marks the exact spot on her quarterdeck where Nelson fell. She has outlasted the empires she fought for and against. She has outlasted the very age of sail that created her. She has outlasted every other warship of her era, and most of the buildings that were standing when she was launched. And she shows no signs of stopping. Over the 6 segments that follow, we will walk through every chapter of this extraordinary ship's life, from the forests of England that gave her her bones, to the storm-torn waters of Trafalgar, to the remarkable story of how a rotting hulk was transformed into the most beloved and visited warship on Earth. We will meet the men who built her, the admirals who commanded her, the ordinary sailors who lived and died within her oak walls, and the historians and restorers who have dedicated their lives to ensuring she endures for centuries more. There is no need to rush. History, when it is this rich, deserves to be savored. Take a breath, settle in. We are going aboard. There is a forest in England that no longer exists. It stood, in the middle years of the 18th century, across the rolling hills and valleys of the English countryside. Oak trees of enormous age and girth. their canopies wide enough to shade a farmhouse, their root systems threaded so deeply into the chalk and clay of the English earth that they had been growing, quietly and steadily, since the Wars of the Roses. They were not felled for furniture or for firewood or for the beams of some great manor house. They were felled for something far more demanding. They were felled for a warship, and not just any warship. They were felled for her. The order that started everything. Britain was in the grip of what history would come to call the 7 Years' War. A conflict so vast in its geographical reach that some historians have called it the first true world war. It was being fought across Europe, across North America, across India, across the West Indies, and across every ocean in between. The Royal Navy was stretched thin, working hard, and the men at the Admiralty knew, with the particular clarity that comes from studying casualty reports and fleet disposition charts, that the Navy needed something bigger, something that would shift the balance not just in a single battle, but across the entire ocean for a generation. The order went out in July 1759. A new first-rate ship of the line was to be constructed at Chatham Dockyard on the River Medway in Kent. She was to be one of the largest and most powerful warships ever built in Britain. Her estimated cost was $63,076, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to tens of millions in today's money, and a figure that would, inevitably and characteristically, be exceeded before she was finished. She was given her name before a single plank was laid: Victory. It was a name that carried weight. It was a name that announced intention, the men behind the design. The man most responsible for Victory's design was Sir Thomas Slade, Surveyor of the Navy, one of the most gifted naval architects Britain ever produced. Slade was not a flamboyant man. He was a technician, a mathematician, a patient and exacting professional who understood better than almost anyone alive the precise relationship between a ship's hull shape, her displacement, her center of gravity, and her performance in heavy seas. He was not interested in designing ships that looked impressive in harbor. He was interested in designing ships that worked in a gale, in a battle, in the worst conditions the ocean could produce. His design for Victory drew on everything the Royal Navy had learned from decades of hard experience, from fleet actions lost and won, from ships that had proven unexpectedly nimble, and ships that had wallowed like barges the moment they left sheltered water. He gave her a relatively fine entry at the bow, allowing her to cut through head seas rather than pound into them. He gave her a lower center of gravity than many of her contemporaries, making her more stable as a gun platform in rolling swells. And he gave her that 3-deck arrangement of guns, 30 on the lower deck, 28 on the middle deck, 30 on the upper deck, supplemented by lighter guns on the quarterdeck, forecastle, and poop, which made her not merely powerful, but comprehensively powerful at every range of engagement. The design was, in the estimation of naval historians who have studied it for centuries afterward, close to perfect for its purpose, which makes what happened next all the more remarkable. The long wait at Chatham, the keel of HMS Victory was laid on the 23rd of July, 1759, at the old single dock at Chatham. And then the world seemed to slow down around her. Shipbuilding of this scale was not a swift business. The great curved timbers that formed her frames had to be cut from trees grown into precisely the right natural shapes. The bends and angles required could not simply be forced from straight timber without compromising strength. Shipwrights called these naturally curved pieces compass timber, and they were among the most valuable and hardest to source materials in the entire enterprise. Agents scoured the woodlands of southern England, measuring trees, assessing grain, calculating whether a particular oak's natural curve might serve as a knee, a futtock, or a floor timber somewhere deep in Victory's hull. The work was painstaking. The labor force was enormous. At peak periods, hundreds of skilled shipwrights, caulkers, sawyers, ropemakers, riggers, blacksmiths, and laborers worked simultaneously on the hull and her components. The smell of fresh-cut oak, of hot pitch, of Stockholm tar would have hung over Chatham Dockyard like a permanent weather system. And yet, 6 years passed before she was finished. She was launched on the 7th of May, 1765, sliding into the Medway on a warm spring day, already an object of enormous national pride. And then, in one of the stranger chapters in naval history, she was promptly towed to a mooring buoy and left there. For 13 years, the 7 Years' War had ended, the immediate strategic need had passed, and the Admiralty, with the pragmatic ruthlessness of bureaucracies throughout history, simply put her in ordinary. The 18th century term for laying up a warship in reserve and left her to sit. She was maintained, inspected periodically, kept watertight. But she did not sail. The most powerful warship Britain had ever built spent the first 13 years of her existence moored quietly in the Medway, waiting. There are worse places to wait than the river country of Kent, but still, 13 years. The ship comes alive. It was the American Revolutionary War that finally woke her. By 1778, Britain found itself at war, not only with her rebellious American colonies, but with France, and shortly afterward with Spain as well. The strategic situation was suddenly grave. The Channel needed protecting. The Atlantic trade routes needed defending. The fleet needed its best ships, and its best ships needed to be at sea. HMS Victory was taken in hand for a thorough fitting out and refit, her rigging completed, her guns mounted, her stores loaded, and her crew, the first of many crews she would carry over the coming decades, brought aboard. She was commissioned in February 1778 under the command of Captain John Lindsay, and she was immediately impressive. Contemporary accounts describe the reaction of officers and sailors alike upon first seeing her fully rigged and ready for sea. She was immense, yes, that was apparent from a mile away. But she was also, to the eye of anyone who understood ships, beautifully proportioned. There was nothing clumsy or blunt about her. For all her size and weight, she had an air of purpose about her that smaller, nimbler-seeming vessels often lacked. She looked, in a word that recurs again and again in the accounts of those who knew her, inevitable. Her first posting was as flagship of the Channel Fleet, flying the flag of Admiral Augustus Keppel. Within months, she was in action, participating in the indecisive Battle of Ushant in July 1778, her guns in use for the first time, her crew beginning to learn what kind of ship they served aboard, the life below decks. To understand Victory, you must spend a little time below her waterline, not in the gun decks, not at the gleaming brass of the officers' quarters, but in the dark, low, thunderously loud spaces where most of her crew actually lived. The lower gun deck, when cleared for action, was a cathedral of oak and iron. The guns, 30 of them on this deck alone, each weighing over 2 tons, sat on their carriages in the dim light, their muzzles run out through the open gun ports, the sea visible through those ports as a narrow, glittering strip of grey or blue or black depending on the season and the weather. The noise of this deck in battle was something no man who experienced it ever forgot or fully recovered from. The concussion of a broadside fired below decks was not merely a sound, it was a physical event. It compressed the air in your chest. It rattled your teeth. Men went deaf on the lower gun deck, Gradually, over years of service, their hearing eroded by 10-gun, 20-gun, 30-gun broadsides, and they considered this simply an occupational reality, no more remarkable than a blacksmith's scorched forearms. Below the lower gun deck was the all-up, where the light of the sun never reached. This was where the surgeon worked, and it was here, famously, that Lord Nelson would be carried on the afternoon of Trafalgar. The carpenter's stores were here, and the cable tier, where the enormous anchor cables were coiled in great loops that smelled of river mud and the sea. The midshipmen, boys, many of them, some as young as 12, had their berths here, slung in hammocks between the great coils of rope, learning to sleep through the groaning of the hull and the perpetual sound of water running along the ship's sides just inches away. The food was monotonous: salt beef, hard biscuit, dried peas, the occasional cheese. The water was stored in casks, and was frequently brackish and unpleasant by any standard that would recognize the word. The beer, for beer was the default daily ration aboard Royal Navy ships, was more reliably drinkable, which tells you something about the water situation. And yet men lived in this environment for months, sometimes for years, and some of them came to feel about it, as one might feel about a difficult but deeply familiar home. The ship had a smell, a motion, a sound that was entirely her own. You learned it the way you learn the sounds of a house at night, and after a while it was simply where you lived. What made her different? Many first-rate ships were built in the 18th century. Several were powerful, well-designed, competently handled. What separated Victory from the common run was not any single quality, but the convergence of several simultaneously: a hull design of exceptional seakeeping ability, a construction quality that survived decades of hard service, a sequence of commanders who flew their flags from her decks and left something of their own reputations in her timbers, and, perhaps most of all, the accumulated weight of experience that her long service gave her crews. Sailors who had served aboard Victory talked about her differently than sailors talked about other ships. There was a pride there that was not quite like the pride of serving on any other vessel. Part of it was practical. She was, by virtually any measure, the finest fighting platform in the Royal Navy. Part of it was historical. By the time of Trafalgar, she had already been in service for 27 years and had seen 3 wars. And part of it was something more ineffable: the sense, aboard this particular ship, that the wood and rope and iron you served among had already proven what it could do and would prove it again. She was not simply a ship. She was, to the men who sailed her, a promise. There are pairings in history so complete, so perfectly matched in temperament and purpose, that it becomes almost impossible to think of one without the other. Wellington and Waterloo, Churchill and the Blitz, and, standing quietly but unmistakably among them, Nelson and Victory. It was not simply that Horatio Nelson commanded HMS Victory. Many admirals had flown their flags from her mainmast before him, and she had served them well. It was something more than that. It was that Nelson and Victory seemed, in retrospect, to have been made for each other, the man and the ship completing something in the other that had been missing before they met. Nelson gave Victory her immortality, and Victory gave Nelson the stage upon which his genius could finally, fully, catastrophically shine. To understand that union, you must first understand the man, a most unlikely hero. Horatio Nelson was born on the 29th of September, 1758, the same year, as it happens, that the order was placed for Victory's construction. He was the 6th of 11 children born to a Norfolk clergyman, raised in a cold rectory in the village of Burnham Thorpe, a child of modest means, modest height, and immodest ambition. He was slight, frequently ill, and from an early age had an almost theatrical need to be at the center of whatever was happening around him. His officers and contemporaries would describe him variously as magnetic, exhausting, vain, generous, reckless, and irreplaceable. They were all correct simultaneously, which is perhaps the most honest thing one can say about genius. He entered the Royal Navy at the age of 12, common enough for the era, and rose with a speed that owed something to patronage, but rather more to ability. By the age of 20, he commanded his own vessel. By his 30s, he had lost the sight of his right eye in action at Calvi, and later his right arm in a disastrous night assault at Tenerife. He returned home from that failure pale, in agony, and deeply despondent, and was back at sea within months, because there was simply nowhere else for him to be. The Navy was not merely Nelson's career. It was his entire inner world. On land he was restless, disorganized, susceptible to vanity, and to romantic entanglement in ways that caused considerable personal scandal. At sea he was transformed, focused, brilliant, absolutely certain. The ocean steadied him. Command completed him. And when, in 1803, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet and hoisted his flag aboard HMS Victory for the first time, something in both of them, the man and the ship, seemed to recognize that it had arrived where it was always meant to be. First meeting Nelson came aboard Victory on the 18th of May 1803 at Portsmouth. She had recently completed a significant refit and was in fine condition, her copper bottom freshly inspected, her rigging overhauled, her gun decks clean and properly equipped. He was 44 years old, one-eyed, one-armed, and the most famous naval officer in the world. Those who were present that day recorded that he walked her gun decks slowly, and with evident pleasure. He ran his one remaining hand along the breech of a 12-pounder, inspected the tackles and breaching ropes with the eye of a man who had spent his life around naval guns, asked quiet and precise questions of the ship's officers, and expressed himself satisfied. But there was something in his manner beyond professional appraisal. He had a way of treating Victory as though she were a living thing, which, in every sense that mattered, she was. His quarters aboard Victory were those of the Vice Admiral, a stern cabin of reasonable size, lit by the great windows across the stern, furnished with a cot, a dining table, a desk at which he wrote the thousands of letters that poured from him almost daily throughout his command. He was a prodigious correspondent, to the Admiralty, to his captains, to his prize agents, to Emma Hamilton, the great love of his scandalous personal life, to his daughter Horatia, whose existence was an open secret in the fleet, if not in polite society. Seated at that desk, with the Atlantic or the Mediterranean moving beneath him, and the sounds of the ship going about its work overhead, he was, by all accounts, at his most contented. The waiting game. The long watch off Cadiz. The 2 years that preceded Trafalgar were not, for the men of Victory and the Mediterranean Fleet, a time of constant action. They were, in many ways, something considerably harder, a time of ceaseless vigilance, of storms endured and boredom survived, of watching and waiting for an enemy that kept itself stubbornly in port. The French fleet, under Admiral Villeneuve, combined with a substantial Spanish squadron, was based at Cadiz on the southwestern coast of Spain. Nelson's orders were to keep them there, or to destroy them if they came out. For months, through the long swells of the Atlantic winter and the calmer but exhausting days of summer, Victory and her consorts patrolled the approaches to Cadiz, beating back and forth on the same lines of water, their crews maintaining the guns, the sails, the rigging, the hull, the endless and perpetual labor of keeping a ship of this size functional and ready for immediate action. Nelson dealt with the tedium in the manner of great commanders. He worked, he wrote, he socialized with extraordinary deliberateness, rotating his captains through a sequence of dinners aboard Victory, building among them the understanding and mutual trust that he knew would be essential when the battle finally came. He talked through his tactical ideas at these dinners with a frankness that surprised men accustomed to admirals who kept their intentions close. He wanted his captains not merely to follow his orders, but to understand his thinking so thoroughly that they could act on it in the chaos and noise and smoke of battle, when orders could not be passed, and independent judgment would be everything. He called them his band of brothers, borrowing the phrase from Shakespeare's Henry V, and the name was not mere sentiment, it described something real. By the time October arrived, the captains of Nelson's fleet knew their admiral's mind almost as well as he did himself. They were ready. And then, finally, so was Villeneuve. The signal. On the morning of the 19th of October, 1805, the frigates watching Cadiz sent the signal Nelson had been anticipating for 2 years. The combined fleet was coming out. He was overjoyed, not exhilarated in the conventional chest-thumping sense, but genuinely, quietly, almost serenely glad. This was what he had been built for. This was what victory had been built for. He wrote in his private diary that night, a short prayer, asking God for a great and glorious victory, and for the humanity to deal with whatever followed. It is a remarkable document, utterly without bombast, entirely sincere, the prayer of a man who understood precisely what the next few days would require of him. The fleet set course to intercept. By the morning of the 21st, the two forces were in sight of each other. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet numbered 33 ships of the line. Nelson had 27. The enemy outnumbered him in ships, in guns, and in the total weight of metal that could be thrown in a single broadside. What Nelson had, in addition to the immeasurable advantage of British gunnery training and seamanship, was a plan of such aggressive originality that Villeneuve, who had studied Nelson's methods carefully and feared them deeply, did not have a reliable counter to it. Nelson would attack, not in the traditional line, broadside to broadside, but in 2 columns, driving perpendicular to the enemy's line, cutting through it at 2 points, surrounding segments of the enemy fleet, and turning the battle into a close-range melee in which British advantages in speed of fire and individual ship handling would be decisive. It was breathtakingly risky. The leading ships of each column would endure withering fire for perhaps half an hour before they broke the enemy line and could bring their own guns to bear. It was an attack that asked the men at the front to absorb enormous punishment on trust. Trust in the plan, trust in the admiral, trust in the ship. Nelson knew this. He had wrestled with it. His captains, when he had briefed them, had understood it and accepted it. And it was victory that would lead one of those 2 columns. It was victory that would take the first fire. The last morning Nelson rose before dawn on the 21st of October, dressed carefully, and made several entries in his diary. He wrote a codicil to his will, leaving Emma Hamilton and their daughter Horatia to the care of his country, a bequest the country would shamefully neglect to honor. He then went up on deck, into the grey Atlantic morning, and looked at his fleet in the light. Something in him knew. He had always had a quality that those close to him described with unease, a sense of foreknowledge about his own fate. He had spoken of it obliquely to friends on more than one occasion, and those who heard him had generally responded with the embarrassed dismissal that people offer to things they do not want to believe. But on this morning, before this battle, it seems to have been present in him very clearly. He was calm. He was, by all accounts, luminously calm. He wore, on the breast of his uniform coat, the 4 decorations of the orders of chivalry he held, glittering stars of enamel and metal that caught the light as he moved. His officers urged him to cover them, or to change into a plain coat. A French marksman at close range would target an officer decorated so conspicuously, they told him, with the respectful urgency of men who did not want to seem to doubt their admiral's judgment, but desperately needed him to reconsider. He declined. He had always worn his decorations in battle. He was not going to stop now. At around 11 in the morning, with the 2 fleets closing, he composed the signal that every English schoolchild has known by heart for 2 centuries. It was signaled to the fleet flag by flag, the coloured bunting breaking out from Victory's halyards in sequence. England expects that every man will do his duty. The response from the fleet, rising from dozens of ships simultaneously, was a roar of cheering that carried even across the wind. Nelson turned to his flag captain, Thomas Hardy, and said simply that he was satisfied. Then he went below to pray once more, briefly and privately, and came back on deck as the guns began to speak what the ship carried. In the hours that followed, HMS Victory absorbed punishment that would have destroyed most ships outright. Sailing at the head of Nelson's column, she was raked repeatedly before she could bring her own broadside to bear. Her sails cut to ribbons, her rigging damaged, men killed and wounded on her decks by fire. She could not yet return. She held her course. She did not waver. She closed with the enemy line until her bowsprit was almost touching the stern of the French flagship Bucentaure. And then she fired. A single devastating broadside through the Bucentaure's stern windows that swept the entire length of her gun decks and put 400 French sailors out of action in minutes. She had broken the line, and the battle had truly begun. Nelson was shot at approximately 1015 in the afternoon, struck by a musket ball fired from the top of the French ship Redoutable, which lay locked alongside Victory in savage close combat. The ball entered his left shoulder, passed through his lung, and lodged against his spine. He fell on the quarterdeck, his hand instinctively covering his decorations to prevent the men from seeing whose blood it was. He was carried below, to the orlop deck, to the surgeon's space in the dim light beneath the waterline. And there, as the battle raged above him, and as Victory continued to fight with everything she had, he lay, conscious for several hours, asking repeatedly how the battle went, told repeatedly that it went well, drifting at last into the particular stillness that lies beyond pain. He died at 4:30 in the afternoon. The battle was, by then, won. There is a particular quality to the light off the southwestern coast of Spain in late October. It is not the hard, bleaching brightness of high summer, nor the grey heaviness of a northern winter. It is something softer than both. A long, golden, almost melancholy light that lies low across the water and turns the swells, a deep shade of pewter blue. It is the kind of light that painters seek and poets describe. It is, in its way, a beautiful light. On the morning of the 21st of October, 1805, 33 French and Spanish ships of the line were moving through it, and from the northwest, on a light wind that barely filled their sails, 27 British ships were moving to meet them. The men on both sides could see each other for hours before the battle began. That was perhaps the hardest part, the weight of waiting at sea. Unlike on land, a battle rarely begins suddenly. There is almost always a long, slow approach, sometimes lasting the better part of a day, during which both fleets maneuver, captains study the enemy through their telescopes, and the men at the guns sit beside their weapons and wait. The waiting is its own ordeal. There is time to think, which is perhaps the last thing a man about to enter close-range naval combat actually wants. Aboard Victory and the ships of Nelson's fleet, the morning was spent in preparation that had the quality of ritual. The gun decks were wet-sanded to give men footing in the blood that would inevitably come. The guns were loaded and their flintlocks primed. Buckets of water and sand were placed at intervals along each deck. The water for swapping the guns between shots, the sand for the same reason the deck had been sanded. The surgeon, Dr. William Beatty, laid out his instruments in the orlop, the saws, the tourniquets, the ligatures, the probes. He had, by his own later account, a premonition of the scale of what was coming, and he prepared accordingly. The men ate a meal. It was near enough to the dinner hour that the cook managed to serve something, though the galley fire would be extinguished the moment action began. They ate, many of them, with the appetite of men who have made a decision they cannot unmake, and who have chosen, having made it, simply to be present in the moment. Sailors of the 18th century were not, by and large, given to written reflection, but those few who later described this meal spoke of it with a strange warmth. The bread, the salt meat, the small beer, shared with the men they had worked and slept and complained alongside for months. There was something in it of the Last Supper, without the conscious drama. Just men eating together and knowing it mattered. The formation. The two fleets approached each other on nearly perpendicular headings. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet, under Admiral Villeneuve, had formed a rough line of battle stretching several miles from north to south. Though the line was ragged, its intervals uneven, its order compromised by the light winds that made precise station-keeping almost impossible. Villeneuve was already aware that his fleet, however numerous, was not in good condition. Many of his Spanish ships were poorly manned, their crews a mixture of soldiers and landsmen pressed into naval service because trained seamen were in chronically short supply. Even the French ships, though somewhat better prepared, had spent months bottled up in Cadiz, their crews soft from inaction and their provisions beginning to run short. Nelson's fleet, by contrast, was in the finest possible condition. The product of 2 years of constant sea service, unceasing drill, and the morale that comes from serving under an admiral. Every man in the fleet believed to be genuinely, almost supernaturally gifted. They were leaner, faster at the guns, and more accustomed to working their ships in the variable winds and heavy swells of the Atlantic than their opponents. What they lacked in numbers, they more than compensated for in readiness. The British fleet advanced in 2 columns. The northern column, led by Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood in the Royal Sovereign, was aimed at the rear of the enemy line. Nelson's column, with Victory at its head, was aimed at the center, at Villeneuve's own flagship, the Bucentaure, and the ships immediately surrounding it. The approach took the better part of the morning. The wind was so light at times that the great ships barely made steerage way, creeping forward through the long Atlantic swells at walking pace or slower. On the gun decks men waited. The first shots. It was the Royal Sovereign that fired first, or rather, received fire first, Collingwood's column reaching the enemy line slightly ahead of Nelson's. She broke through the line at around noon, passing under the stern of the Spanish Santa Ana and delivering a devastating raking broadside as she did so, before finding herself temporarily alone among 4 enemy ships, fighting them all simultaneously with a ferocity that silenced even those watching from a distance in admiration. Nelson, watching Royal Sovereign go in, turned to Hardy and said, with evident pleasure, "See how that noble fellow Collingwood carries his ship into action." Collingwood, watching from the Royal Sovereign, would later say he saw Nelson's signal and felt, as always, steadied by it. Victory's approach was slower and more deliberate, the enemy concentrating an increasing weight of fire on her as she came on. The French ships ahead of Victory fired at her continuously for perhaps 40 minutes before she could respond. This was the price of Nelson's tactic. The ships leading the columns were required to absorb punishment without being able to return it until the last possible moment. Victory's sails were riddled, her rigging damaged, her wheel shot away. After which she was steered from below. Men on the tiller following shouted orders relayed down through the ship. Men died on her decks in 1s and 2s. Then in larger numbers as the range closed and the enemy fire grew more accurate. And still she came on. Her captain, Thomas Hardy, walked the quarterdeck beside Nelson with that particular studied calm that senior officers felt obliged to display, aware that the men watching them drew their own courage, partly from what they saw in their commanders' faces. Both men knew that they were the most conspicuous targets on the most conspicuous ship in the approaching fleet. Both men walked steadily regardless, breaking the line. And then she fired. The gun crews of Victory's lower gun deck had been waiting for this moment for the better part of an hour, crouched beside their loaded guns in the half-dark, listening to the sounds of the battle developing above and around them, feeling the impacts of enemy shot through the soles of their feet, smelling the powder smoke beginning to drift through the open gun ports. They were ready in a way that went beyond preparation. They were coiled. The broadside that Victory fired through the stern windows of Busan Tower was later described by French survivors as catastrophic beyond anything they had imagined possible. A single raking broadside, fired at near point-blank range through the most vulnerable part of a ship's hull. The unarmored stern sweeps the entire length of the gun decks in a single pass, the cannonballs traveling the full length of the ship, dismounting guns, destroying carriages, killing and maiming men in a continuous, unstoppable line. The Bucentaur had over 900 men aboard. The single broadside from Victory followed almost immediately by further fire as the British ship passed, put somewhere between 400 and 450 of them out of action. The French flagship's fighting capacity was essentially destroyed in minutes. Victory had not paused. She pushed through the gap in the enemy line and found herself alongside the French 74-gun Red Torbal under the command of Captain Jean Lucas, a man who, unlike many of his contemporaries, had spent the time in Cadiz training his crew relentlessly in musketry and in the art of boarding. Lucas had recognized that his guns could not match the British ship's gun for gun, and had therefore turned his ship into something closer to a floating infantry regiment. His men were packed into the tops, the platforms high on the masts, armed with muskets, grenades, and swivel guns, ready to sweep the enemy's upper decks of officers and men at close range. It was this decision, made months before in a harbor in Spain, that would determine everything. The shot that changed history. Victory and Redoutable came together with a grinding crash, their hulls locked so close that the gun ports could not be opened. The ships were simply too near each other, pressed together by the weight of the battle around them. The fighting on the upper decks became immediate and savage. Marines and sailors on both ships fired at each other at distances of feet. Grenades were thrown, boarders were repelled. The noise was, by every account, so complete and total as to be almost beyond description. The crash of guns, the screaming of rigging, the sounds of men in close combat, all compounding into a single sustained roar that made individual thought almost impossible. At approximately 1015 in the afternoon, Sergeant Robert Guillemard, a French marksman positioned in Redoutable's mizzen top, perhaps 15 yards from Victory's quarterdeck, fired a single musket ball. It struck Nelson in the left shoulder, passed through the epaulette on his uniform coat, and drove downward through his chest. He fell immediately, catching himself with his one arm, then collapsing. Hardy, walking beside him, was at his side in seconds. "They have done for me at last, Hardy," Nelson said. "My backbone is shot through." He was carried below by 4 sailors, his face and the decorations on his chest covered with a handkerchief so the men would not see who it was. He had insisted on this, not from vanity, but from the knowledge that the sight of their admiral being carried below, wounded, might falter men at a moment when faltering was not an option. The battle continued for nearly 3 hours after Nelson fell. Above him, Victory fought on, her crew working their guns with a speed and discipline that the French and Spanish, even in the midst of their own desperate resistance, recognized as extraordinary. The Redoutable, pounded into submission at point-blank range, eventually struck her colors. Around her, the battle was collapsing in the combined fleet's favor, or rather, against it. Ship after ship struck to British opponents. The line, once broken in 2 places, had dissolved entirely into the chaos Nelson had designed it to become. And in that chaos, the British were proving overwhelming. The hours below, in the orlop of Victory, in the dim amber light of lanterns hung from the deck beams above. Dr. Beatty worked his way through the wounded as they were brought below. The cockpit, the surgeon's space, was crowded, the air thick with the smells of blood and powder smoke, and the particular damp closeness of a space far below the waterline on a working ship. Nelson lay on a pallet, propped slightly upright, attended by Beatty and by the Reverend Scott, his chaplain and personal secretary, who had been with him throughout the Mediterranean command, and who now simply sat close to him and held his hand when he could. Nelson was conscious, aware, in considerable pain. He asked for water. He asked, again and again, how the battle was going. He was told truthfully that it was going well, that ships were striking, that Villeneuve's fleet was in disorder. He asked for Hardy. Hardy came down twice, briefly. There was a battle to fight, and the two men spoke quietly in terms that were recorded afterward by those close enough to hear. At their second meeting, Hardy told him that 14 or 15 enemy ships had already been taken. Nelson said it was not enough. He wanted 20. He spoke of Emma. He spoke of Horatia. He asked, with a characteristic practicality of a man whose mind remained clear even as his body failed, that Hardy make sure his hair was cut and sent to her. At 4003 in the afternoon of the 21st of October, 1805, Horatio Nelson died. Above him, on the gun decks and the quarterdeck, and in the riddled rigging of the ship he had loved and commanded and made immortal, the battle was over. 22 enemy ships had been taken or destroyed. Not one British ship had been lost. The combined fleet of France and Spain would never again seriously challenge Britain's command of the sea. The victory was total, and it had cost everything. The guns fell silent sometime in the late afternoon of the 21st of October, 1805. The smoke, which had been so thick during the height of the battle that captains could not see their own consorts through it, began slowly to clear, drifting westward on the same light breeze that had carried the two fleets toward each other that morning, thinning and dispersing until the long golden light of the Spanish evening could reach the water again. What it illuminated was extraordinary in its devastation. The sea around the battle was covered for miles with wreckage, broken spars, tangled rigging, shattered planking, upturned boats, the personal effects of men living and dead. 22 enemy ships sat as prizes among the British fleet, their colours struck, their decks crowded with wounded men, and the dazed survivors of crews that had been fought to the point of collapse. Several of the prizes were so badly damaged that keeping them afloat was itself an urgent and exhausting task. Others had caught fire during the fighting, and the work of extinguishing those fires, carefully, with one eye always on the powder magazines deep in their holds, occupied hundreds of men through the remainder of the afternoon. HMS Victory herself bore the marks of the afternoon in ways that would have astonished anyone who had seen her that morning. Her sails were in shreds. Her rigging was a chaos of cut ropes, fallen spars, and tangled cordage that her crew were already beginning to clear and repair with the methodical professionalism of men who had been trained to work under exactly these conditions. Her hull had been struck by enemy shot dozens of times. Her upper works were scarred and splintered. 57 of her men were dead. 102 were wounded, some severely, in ways that would leave them permanently diminished. And somewhere below her waterline, in the orlop, her admiral lay still, the storm that followed. Before the grief could fully settle, before the work of taking stock could be completed, nature presented the fleet with a crisis more immediately dangerous than anything Villeneuve had managed to achieve. A gale was coming. It had been building in the Atlantic for days, gathering itself beyond the horizon while the two fleets maneuvered and fought, and now, in the hours following the battle, it arrived with a violence that struck the exhausted and depleted British fleet as almost personally cruel. The winds rose sharply through the evening of the 21st and into the 22nd, building to a full Atlantic gale that battered ships already structurally compromised by battle damage, crewed by men who had been fighting and working without sleep for the better part of 2 days. The prizes were the immediate crisis. Captured ships, stripped of their best officers and much of their crew, with skeleton British prize crews aboard who were often unfamiliar with the ship's particular handling characteristics, were desperately difficult to manage in heavy weather at the best of times. In a full gale, with their rigging damaged and their hulls leaking from battle damage, many of them became simply unmanageable. Several were driven onto the shoals near Cadiz and wrecked. Others, their prize crews unable to keep them off a lee shore, were reluctantly abandoned, their British sailors taken off, and the ships left to destruction rather than risk the lives of the men trying to hold them. Of the 22 prizes taken at Trafalgar, only 4 were successfully brought into Gibraltar. The rest were lost to the gale, or scuttled, or recaptured by the Spanish. Victory herself rode out the storm under jury rig, makeshift temporary rigging cobbled together from whatever spars and cordage remained serviceable, her crew working round the clock to keep her manageable and to prevent the storm from doing what the guns of France and Spain had failed to do. She made Gibraltar eventually, battered and desperately in need of repair, but afloat. She was, as she had always been, obstinately unsinkable. The long voyage home. The question of what to do with Nelson's body was handled with a practicality and irreverence that were, in their combination, very characteristic of the Royal Navy of the period. Dr. Beatty understood immediately that a voyage back to England, which would take weeks, possibly longer depending on winds and the required stops, made conventional burial at sea impossible. Nelson was far too significant a figure, and far too beloved, to be committed to the ocean without the elaborate state funeral that everyone in the fleet knew was coming. So Beatty arranged for the body to be placed in a large cask. One account says filled with brandy and camphor, another that it was a mixture of spirits of wine, which was then lashed securely in the after part of the hold, where it would be kept as cool as possible during the voyage. It is, admittedly, a somewhat undignified image, but it was also a deeply practical one, and the men of the fleet understood it as such. They were sailors. They dealt in the realities of the sea, and the realities of the sea included the fact that preservation required ingenuity. Nelson himself, they felt sure, would have approved of a solution that was sensible, effective, and wasted no unnecessary time on sentiment when there was work to be done. Victory limped home over the following weeks, stopping at Gibraltar for urgent repairs, then making the long haul north and west around the Iberian Peninsula, through the Bay of Biscay, which treated her with its customary merciless indifference to the significance of the ship crossing it, and finally up the English Channel toward Portsmouth. She arrived at Spithead on the 4th of December, 1805, 44 days after the battle. The news had arrived long before her, a nation in mourning. The first dispatches reporting the victory at Trafalgar had reached London on the 6th of November, carried by the schooner Pickle, the smallest vessel in Nelson's fleet, and, as history would have it, one of the swiftest. Lieutenant John Lapenotiere had ridden through the night from Falmouth to the Admiralty in London, changing horses at every stage, arriving in the early hours of the morning, and delivering the dispatches to William Marsden, the first Secretary of the Admiralty, with the words that would be repeated in every newspaper in Britain within hours. "Sir, we have gained a great victory, but we have lost Lord Nelson." The reaction was unlike anything Britain had experienced in living memory, or perhaps in any memory at all. There had been great victories before. There had been great men lost before. But the combination, a victory so complete, so strategically decisive, and simultaneously a loss so personal and so total, produced a national response that went beyond celebration or mourning into something that had no quite adequate name. Streets that should have been full of cheering were instead full of people standing quietly, speaking softly, some of them weeping openly in a manner that the reserved British national character of the period did not generally permit, or encourage. The newspapers that would normally have blazed with triumphant headlines instead printed long, careful elegies. Sermons were preached in churches across the country. His portrait, the slight, one-eyed, one-armed figure in his admiral's coat, the decorations on his breast, appeared in windows and on broadsides everywhere. Men who had never met him, who had never been within 100 miles of the sea, felt they had lost something personal. Something that had been part of their understanding of the world was now gone, and the victory that should have made them exultant instead made them ache. It was, in its way, the first great outpouring of modern national grief. The first time that a public figure's death had been felt, simultaneously and with genuine personal intensity, by an entire country. It would not be the last time Britain would experience this, but it was perhaps the first. The state funeral. Nelson's body was brought ashore from Victory on the 22nd of December, 1805, at Greenwich, where it lay in state in the Painted Hall for 3 days. The queues of people waiting to pay their respects stretched for miles. Boats crowded the Thames. Men, women, and children stood for hours in the December cold without complaint, waiting their turn to file past the coffin that had been made, with characteristic symbolism, from the wood of L'Orient, the French flagship destroyed at the Battle of the Nile, one of Nelson's own earlier victories. The state funeral took place on the 9th of January 1806. The funeral procession moved from the Admiralty to St. Paul's Cathedral, through streets lined with silent crowds, the black-draped barge carrying the coffin up the Thames, attended by a flotilla of boats, the cathedral itself filled with the peers, officers, politicians, and dignitaries of a nation that wished to mark the occasion with every ceremony at its disposal. 32 of Victory's own sailors, weather-beaten and solemn in their best clothes, walked in the procession as a guard of honor. The men who had served with him, who had carried him below after he fell, who had sailed him home. It was one of the largest and most elaborate state funerals in British history, and at its center was a man who had stood 5 feet 4 inches in his stockinged feet, who had been chronically seasick throughout most of his career, and who had, on the morning of his greatest battle, calmly refused to change his coat. What Victory carried after Trafalgar? In the years immediately following Trafalgar, HMS Victory continued in service, repaired, refitted, and returned to the sea that was her natural element. She served as flagship of the Channel Fleet, and later of other commands. Her name and her record lending an authority to whatever flag flew from her mainmast that no other ship in the Royal Navy could quite match. But something had changed. She was no longer simply a warship. She had become, in the consciousness of the Royal Navy and of the British public, something more layered and more significant than that. She was a relic, as much as a vessel, a physical connection to a man, and a moment that the country had collectively decided was sacred. Officers posted to her felt it. Visitors who came aboard at Portsmouth felt it. Even those who had no particular feeling for naval history found themselves quietened and thoughtful on her decks in a way they had not expected. The spot on her quarterdeck where Nelson had fallen was marked and preserved. The orlop where he had died was pointed out to anyone who wished to see it. Sailors showed these places to visitors with a reverence that was entirely genuine, not performed for the benefit of tourists, but real and deep, passed down from those who had been present to those who came after. She was, in the most literal sense, hallowed ground, or rather, hallowed oak, the long decline, and the decision that saved her. The years were not entirely kind. Naval warfare was changing, and changing fast. The first decades of the 19th century saw the introduction of steam power to naval vessels, initially as auxiliary propulsion for frigates and smaller craft, then gradually, irreversibly, as the primary means of propulsion for the fleet. By the 1820s, the age of sail was not yet over, but its end was visible on the horizon, approaching with the steady, implacable certainty of a tide coming in. Ships like Victory were becoming obsolete. Not immediately, not entirely. She remained a powerful fighting unit on paper for some years, but the direction of travel was clear. The great oak first rates that had defined naval power for a century were giving way to iron-hulled, steam-driven vessels that were faster, more reliable, and less dependent on the vagaries of wind and weather. The investments required to maintain the old ships were increasingly difficult to justify when new designs offered such evident advantages. By the 1820s, Victory was being used primarily as a harbor ship, a static receiving vessel moored at Portsmouth, her days of open-sea sailing essentially over. She was still maintained, still occupied, still officially part of the fleet. But she was no longer a warship in any operational sense. She was, slowly and without any formal declaration being made on the subject, becoming a monument. The critical moment came in 1922, when it was recognized that if nothing decisive was done, she would be lost entirely. Over a century of service and neglect had taken their toll in ways that were becoming structural. She was settled heavily in the mud of Portsmouth Harbour, her hull compromised, her timbers in places rotted beyond repair. A committee was formed, money was raised, and the decision was made, against the opposition of those who thought the cost unjustifiable and the effort quixotic, to restore her. It was, without question, one of the finest decisions anyone connected with the Royal Navy made in the 20th century. She was moved into the dry dock at Portsmouth that she occupies to this day, the oldest dry dock in the world, still in use, and the work began. It would take years. It would cost enormous sums. It would require craftsmen to relearn skills that had not been practiced seriously since the age of sail itself. And it would be, in every respect that matters, absolutely worth it. There is a moment when you walk through the dockyard gates at Portsmouth and catch your first proper glimpse of her that stops most people mid-stride. It is not what you expect. You have seen photographs, perhaps, or paintings, the tall masts, the rows of gun ports, the black and yellow stripes that run in horizontal bands along her hull, each stripe marking a gun deck, each gun deck a world unto itself. You think you are prepared, and then you turn a corner, and there she is, and you discover that you were not prepared at all. She is simply too large, too real, too present. After more than 2.5 centuries of existence, after all the battles and the storms and the years of quiet neglect and the decades of careful restoration, she stands in her dry dock with an authority that photographs cannot convey and words can only approximate. She fills your field of vision. She fills something else as well, something less easy to name, something in the chest, something that has to do with the awareness that you are standing before an object that has existed for longer than any living human being, and that was already old when your great-great-grandparents were young. You take a breath, and then, like every visitor before you going back many decades, you go aboard. The dry dock. The dry dock that holds HMS Victory at Portsmouth Naval Base is itself a piece of history of remarkable antiquity. Built between 1495 and 1496 under the orders of King Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, and therefore a man who died more than 2.5 centuries before, Victory was even laid down. It is the oldest surviving dry dock in the world, still actively in use. To stand at its edge and look down at Victory's hull, with those ancient stone walls rising around her on 3 sides, is to experience the slightly vertiginous sensation of 2 great time frames meeting and overlapping. The dock was drained when Victory was moved into it in 1922, and has remained so ever since. Beneath her keel, which you can see from the dockside, her great curved bottom copper sheathed in the manner of her working years, though the copper itself has been replaced many times over. The dock floor is set with timber supports that hold her precisely in position, distributing the enormous weight of the hull evenly across a bed of carefully calculated props and shores. She is, in a sense, cradled by the dock, the way a ship at sea is cradled by the water, supported from below, held in her natural shape by the force pressing upward against her hull. Maintaining that shape is one of the central preoccupations of the team responsible for her upkeep. Wood, even very old and very well-maintained wood, moves. It swells and contracts with changes in humidity and temperature. It creeps imperceptibly over years under the weight bearing down upon it. The ship's structure is monitored continuously, her frames and planking inspected with a regularity and thoroughness that would not be out of place in the maintenance regime of a modern warship, because HMS Victory is, despite everything, still a commissioned warship. She flies the White Ensign. She is the official flagship of the First Sea Lord, and she is maintained to standards that reflect both those facts. The work of preservation, the restoration that began in earnest in the 1920s and has continued in one form or another ever since, is among the most complex and demanding conservation projects in the world. It is certainly the most complex ongoing maritime conservation project that exists. There is, quite simply, no other example of a wooden sailing warship of this age and size being actively maintained in anything approaching her operational condition. The central challenge is timber, oak. Even the finest English oak used in Victory's original construction has a natural lifespan. The timbers that make up her hull, her decks, her internal structure are not immortal. They absorb moisture. They develop fungal decay. They are eaten by insects. They crack under the stresses of supporting their own weight across centuries. The work of the preservation team is therefore, in large part, the work of identifying deteriorating timber, removing it with great care, and replacing it with new oak of matching quality, cut and shaped to match the original as closely as possible. This sounds straightforward. It is not. Good English oak, of the size and quality required to replace structural timbers in a ship of Victory's dimensions, is not easy to source. The trees required have to be of considerable age and specific character. The same qualities that made the original builder's agents scour the woodlands of 18th century England are still relevant today, 2.5 centuries later. The Forestry Commission and a network of specialist timber suppliers maintain relationships with the Victory preservation team, and there are woodlands in England today that are managed with one eye on the future need for timber of exactly the specifications Victory requires. The craftsmen who do this work are, in their way, among the last practitioners of skills that would otherwise have vanished entirely from the world. The art of working green oak into curved structural shapes, of corking a seam in the manner of an 18th century shipwright, of fitting a treenail, the wooden peg used instead of metal fastenings in many parts of the hull, is not knowledge that exists in any technical manual currently in circulation. It exists in the hands and memories of the people who have learned it by doing it, often from others who learned the same way. The preservation of HMS Victory is, among other things, the preservation of a body of craft knowledge that has no other custodian. What you see when you go aboard. The experience of visiting Victory is unlike that of visiting any other museum ship anywhere in the world, for a reason that becomes apparent the moment you step onto her upper deck. She does not feel like a museum. She feels like a ship. This is partly a matter of philosophy. The decision taken by those responsible for her presentation many decades ago, and maintained consistently since, was that Victory should be displayed, insofar as possible, as she appeared at the time of Trafalgar, not as a sanitized, comfortable version of that ship, but as the real thing, or as close to it as research and craft skill could achieve. The gun decks are laid out as they would have been cleared for action in 1805. The guns are on their carriages, their tackles rigged, the buckets and implements of their use arranged as they would have been arranged that October morning. The surgeon's space in the orlop is set out with the instruments of Dr. Beatty's trade, instruments that are, to modern eyes, both impressive in their precision and sobering in what their presence implies. Walking the lower gun deck in particular is an experience that tends to produce silence in visitors who were talking freely a minute before. It is very low. A tall person must stoop. And it is very dark toward the center, the only natural light entering through the open gun ports, which frame narrow rectangles of the dockyard outside. The guns crowd the space entirely, 30 of them on this deck alone, and you can place your hand on the cold iron of their barrels and understand, in your bones rather than in your head, what it meant to serve them. The barrel of a lower deck gun on Victory weighs over 2 tons. Each one was run out through that gun port by a crew of men hauling on tackles, fired at a rate that the best trained crews in the world's best trained navy could sustain at 2 shots every 90 seconds, then run back in, swabbed, reloaded, primed, and run out again. In the dark, in the smoke, in the noise that no description has ever adequately conveyed. You stand there in the quiet of the modern dockyard, and you try to imagine it. And you find that you cannot, not fully, not really. But you come closer than you would anywhere else on Earth, the quarterdeck. The quarterdeck is where most visitors slow down the longest, and it is not difficult to understand why. It is a wide, open space, wider than you expect from the outside, with the ship's wheel positioned aft and the skylights of the officers' quarters below visible underfoot in the deck planking. The mizzenmast rises from it, and the compass binnacle stands before the wheel with a solidity that suggests permanence. There are gun carriages here too, smaller guns than those below, and the railing at the stern looks out over the dockyard with the slightly elevated perspective of a ship that still, even in dry dock, manages to feel as though it commands the space around it. And there, set into the deck planking near the head of the quarterdeck ladder, is a small brass plaque. It is not large. It does not need to be. It marks the spot, as precisely as historical research has been able to determine it, where Nelson fell on the afternoon of the 21st of October, 1805. Visitors stand before it in ways that vary enormously. Some read it quickly and move on. Some stand for a long time. Some reach down and touch it, which is permitted, and which many people do with a gentleness that seems slightly involuntary, as though the hand moves before the conscious mind has decided anything. Some people, standing there, cry, quietly, without apparent self-consciousness, in the manner of people surprised by an emotion they had not anticipated. They had not expected to feel this. And then they do. It is a remarkable thing about Victory that she produces this response, not only in people with a pre-existing interest in naval history, but in people who had no particular feeling about her before they arrived. She gets to you, somehow, through 260 years of existence, and all the imperfections and compromises of restoration and preservation. She retains the ability to reach across the distance of time and make the past feel genuinely, uncomfortably, beautifully close. The living ship, HMS Victory, is not merely a museum exhibit. This point bears repeating because it is easy to hear it as a formality. A polite fiction maintained by the Royal Navy for reasons of tradition and sentiment. And it is not that at all. She is the official flagship of the First Sea Lord, the professional head of the Royal Navy. The First Sea Lord's flag flies from her mainmast. She is listed in the Navy list as an active commissioned warship. She has a commanding officer, a serving naval captain, whose appointment to the command of Victory is a genuine posting, not an honorary one. There is a ship's company responsible for her maintenance and her daily ceremonial life. She receives official visitors. She is the setting for formal naval occasions. The white ensign that flies from her stern is not a replica or a symbol. It is the real ensign of a real commissioned ship in His Majesty's Royal Navy. This matters. It matters because the decision to maintain Victory as an active commissioned ship taken long ago and never seriously questioned since, means that she is cared for with the seriousness and the resources that the Navy accords to its serving vessels, not with the more limited attention that a pure museum exhibit might receive. Her preservation is a naval responsibility, not merely a heritage one. The standards to which she is maintained reflect that. And it matters for a less institutional reason too. There is something in the continuity of commission, in the unbroken line of service that stretches from her first commissioning in 1778 to the present day, that connects her to every ship and every sailor of the Royal Navy across that entire span. She is not a ship that once was. She is a ship that is. The distinction is not trivial. The distinction is everything. There is one final thing worth knowing as we prepare to draw this documentary to its close. Throughout the south of England, in woodlands managed by the Forestry Commission and by private estates who have entered into agreements with the Victory Preservation Program, there are oak trees growing today that have been designated, formally and legally, as future timber for HMS Victory's restoration. They are not ready yet. They are decades from being ready, some of them. But they have been identified, marked, and protected, on the understanding that when the time comes to replace a particular frame or plank or knee in Victory's hull, the timber will be available. This means that there are trees alive today, growing in the English countryside, that will one day be Victory. That the forest that does not yet exist is already, in its way, beginning to grow. That the ship is not finished, will never be finished, in any final sense, but is instead continuously in the process of becoming herself, incorporating new material into an old and honored form, generation after generation, oak tree after oak tree, craftsman after craftsman, closing reflection. What she means, HMS Victory and the long memory of the sea. There is an old sailor's saying that a ship is not made of wood and rope and iron. A ship, the saying goes, is made of the men who sail her. Standing before HMS Victory in the quiet of a Portsmouth morning, watching the light move across her hull and the white ensign lift and fall in the harbour breeze, you begin to understand what that means in a way that no amount of reading quite prepares you for. Because Victory is not, in the deepest sense, a collection of timber and copper and cast iron. She is a collection of lives. She is the accumulated weight of every man who ever stood her gun decks, worked her rigging, slept in her hold, died in her cockpit, or simply leaned against her rail on a long watch and looked out at the sea and thought whatever private thoughts a sailor thinks at 3 a.m. on an open ocean. She carries all of them still. That is what she is for. What survives empires end. The empire that Victory was built to defend and extend is long gone. Its territories independent, its ambitions dissolved into history, its certainties replaced by different certainties that will themselves one day dissolve. The navy she served has changed beyond the recognition of anyone who sailed her in 1805. Nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, guided missiles, satellites, computers, things that Thomas Hardy or Cuthbert Collingwood could not have conceived of in their most expansive imaginings. The world that made Victory is as remote from us now as the Roman world was remote from the men who built her. And yet, there she stands, unchanged in her essentials, still afloat in her dry dock on her ancient shores, still flying her ensign, still receiving visitors who arrive as strangers and leave as something else, something quieter, something more thoughtful, something with a new and unexpected awareness of how long the past actually is and how close. What survives in Victory is not merely a ship. What survives is the proof that some things are worth preserving beyond all practical justification, that some objects carry so much human meaning, so much accumulated story, that to let them go would be to lose something that cannot be replaced or reconstructed or adequately described in a book. You cannot digitize HMS Victory. You cannot archive her. You cannot make her adequately present through any medium other than the medium of her own physical existence, the grain of her oak, the weight of her guns, the specific quality of the light in her lower gun deck on a grey English afternoon. She must be kept. And so she is kept. The lessons she teaches. Every generation that has encountered Victory has taken something different from her. For those who lived closest to Trafalgar, she was a shrine, the sacred vessel of a sacred man, the physical expression of a grief and a pride that were almost indistinguishable from each other. For the Victorians who came after, she was an emblem of national identity, proof that Britain's greatness was not merely a present fact, but a historical destiny rooted in something as solid and enduring as English oak. For the men and women of the 20th century who fought to save her from decay, she was a responsibility, an obligation to the past that demanded present sacrifice. For us, perhaps, she is something else again. She is a lesson in patience, in the value of things that do not offer immediate returns, in the understanding that some of the most important work a civilization does is the work of remembering, of holding the thread of its own story and refusing to let it go simply because the story is old or inconvenient or expensive to maintain. She is also, in her quiet way, a lesson in humility. To stand on her quarterdeck and look out at the modern world, the cranes, the steel hulls of modern warships, the cars, the glass buildings visible in the middle distance, is to be reminded that the world you currently inhabit is not the permanent condition of human existence. It is one frame of a very long film. Victory was already old before most of the things you consider ancient were built. She will almost certainly outlast most of the things you consider permanent. The last word. When Nelson was dying in the orlop of this ship, in the noise and smoke and terrible urgency of the afternoon of Trafalgar, he said a number of things that were carefully recorded by those present. Some were practical. Some were personal. Some were the expressions of a man in great pain who was trying, with the last of his considerable will, to remain himself. But the words most often remembered are the simplest ones. "Thank God I have done my duty." Spoken quietly, repeated several times in his final hours, they were not the words of a man seeking glory or recognition. They were the words of a man who had found, in the thing he was built to do, a sufficiency, a completeness, a sense of purpose so total that even dying could not diminish it. HMS Victory carries those words in her timbers as surely as she carries anything else. She carries the duty. She carries the cost of it. She carries the knowledge that some things are worth everything, and that the people who understood that, who lived by it, and in some cases died by it, were not so different from the people who stand on her decks today and feel, without quite being able to explain why, that something important happened here. Something important did happen here, and here she remains to remind us of it. Steady on. She endures.